In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. Everyone knew each other's names, and gossip traveled faster than the wind through the narrow streets. It was the kind of place where people liked to think they understood one another, where everyone had their role and no one dared to step too far outside the lines. Clara Bennett lived in this town, just like many others, but her story would soon become one that no one could have anticipated. Clara was an ordinary woman in her late 30s with soft brown eyes and hair always tied back in a simple ponytail. She worked as a part-time bookkeeper at a local grocery store, balancing numbers and ensuring everything added up correctly. Her days were filled with routine, waking up early, making coffee, heading to work, and returning home to her modest apartment. On weekends, she spent her time gardening or reading novels borrowed from the library. To most people in Maplewood, Clara was invisible, a background character in the grand play of life. But what they didn't know was that beneath her calm exterior lay a fierce determination that would one day change everything. One summer morning, Clara found herself sitting nervously in a courtroom, clutching a stack of papers tightly in her hands. This wasn't how she imagined her life turning out. A few months earlier, she had hired a contractor named Mr. Grayson to fix the roof of her aging house. He had promised quick results and reasonable prices, flashing a charming smile that made Clara trust him instantly. But after paying half the fee up front, things took a turn for the worse. Days turned into weeks, and the repairs were left incomplete. When Clara tried to contact Mr. Grayson, he ignored her calls and messages, leaving her frustrated and out of options. With no money left to hire someone else and rain leaking into her living room, she decided to take matters into her own hands. The courthouse was a cold, imposing building with high ceilings and echoing hallways. As Clara stepped inside, she felt completely out of place. The polished floors reflected the nervous expression on her face, and the weight of the documents in her arms seemed heavier with every step. She had never been in court before, and the thought of standing in front of strangers to argue her case terrified her. Still, she reminded herself why she was there, to fight for what was right. Little did she know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would alter her life forever. When her case was called, Clara stood awkwardly beside the plaintiff's table, adjusting her glasses and trying to steady her trembling voice. Across from her sat Mr. Grayson, dressed sharply in a suit, accompanied by a slick lawyer who exuded confidence. The contrast between them was stark. While Clara struggled to explain her situation clearly, stumbling over legal terms she barely understood, the opposing side spoke smoothly, painting her as unreasonable and uninformed. The judge listened impatiently, occasionally interrupting her with sharp questions that only deepened her confusion. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as spectators watched the scene unfold. Some snickered quietly, amused by Clara's clumsiness. Others shook their heads, thinking she had no chance against such a well-prepared opponent. Even the bailiff gave her a sympathetic glance, though it offered little comfort. At one point, when Clara accidentally dropped her papers, scattering them across the floor, a few people laughed outright. Humiliated and overwhelmed, she bent down to gather the scattered sheets, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. For a moment, she considered giving up altogether. Why bother fighting when the odds were so clearly stacked against her? But then, something inside her stirred, a spark of defiance she hadn't felt in years. Clara remembered the nights she'd spent lying awake, worrying about how she'd pay for the unfinished repairs. She recalled the condescending tone Mr. Grayson used when she confronted him, brushing off her concerns as if they were insignificant. Most of all, she thought about the injustice of it all, how someone could take advantage of her simply because she didn't know better. That realization hardened her resolve. No matter how daunting the situation seemed, she refused to let fear or embarrassment silence her. Slowly, she straightened up, squared her shoulders, and continued speaking, even if her voice still wavered. Despite her efforts, the outcome of the case was disappointing. The judge ruled in favor of Mr. Grayson, citing insufficient evidence and procedural errors on Clara's part. As she left the courthouse, defeated and mocked by those around her, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and shame. Yet, amidst the turmoil, A new idea began to form in her mind. If the system couldn't protect her, perhaps she needed to understand it better. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn enough to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. That evening, Clara sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, staring at the pile of legal books she had borrowed from the library earlier that week. They were dense and intimidating, filled with jargon she barely comprehended. But instead of feeling discouraged, she felt a strange sense of excitement. For the first time in years, she had a purpose, one that went beyond fixing her leaky roof or balancing spreadsheets at work. She wanted to learn, to grow, and to stand up for herself and others like her. And so, with a determined glint in her eye, Clara opened the first book and began to read. Little did she know this single act of courage would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform not only her life, but also the lives of countless others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Clara's journey into the world of law began quietly, almost secretly. At first, she told no one, not her co-workers, not her neighbors, and certainly not her family. She didn't want to face their questions or, worse, their doubt. Every evening, after work, she would retreat to her small apartment, close the curtains, and immerse herself in the thick legal books she borrowed from the library. The pages were filled with complex terms and long-winded explanations that often left her head spinning. But Clara was determined. She took notes in a worn-out notebook, highlighting key phrases and underlining sentences that seemed important. Slowly, piece by piece, she started to understand. Her weekends became sacred study sessions. While others in Maplewood spent their Saturdays shopping or attending social gatherings, Clara stayed indoors, poring over case studies and watching online lectures about legal procedures. Sometimes frustration bubbled up inside her. There were moments when she felt like giving up, convinced that the law was too complicated for someone like her to master. But then she would remember the courtroom, the mocking whispers, the condescending smiles, and her resolve would harden again. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving to herself and to the world that anyone could rise above their circumstances if they were willing to fight for it. As weeks turned into months, Clara's confidence grew. She began testing her newfound knowledge by helping friends and neighbors with minor legal issues. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived down the street, came to her one day, worried about a landlord refusing to return her security deposit. Clara carefully reviewed the lease agreement, pointed out clauses that supported Mrs. Thompson's claim, and even drafted a formal letter demanding the refund. To everyone's surprise, the landlord complied without further argument. Word of Clara's success spread quickly, and soon more people started knocking on her door for advice. At first, she only helped with simple matters, drafting letters, explaining basic rights, or guiding people through filling out forms. But as her reputation grew, so did the complexity of the cases she handled. A young couple approached her, desperate for help after being scammed by a car dealership. They had paid for a vehicle that turned out to be faulty, and the dealer refused to issue a refund. Clara spent hours researching consumer protection laws, gathering evidence, and preparing a complaint to file with the local consumer court. When the couple received a favorable ruling, they hugged Clara tightly, tears streaming down their faces. "You saved us," they said gratefully. For Clara, these moments were priceless. Each victory reinforced her belief that she was on the right path. Despite her growing success, not everyone in Maplewood supported her efforts. Some dismissed her work as amateurish, warning others that relying on someone without proper credentials could backfire. Others whispered behind her back, questioning why a bookkeeper would suddenly think she could play lawyer. Even her own brother, during a rare phone call, expressed skepticism. "Why are you wasting your time with this?" he asked bluntly. "You're not going to change the system, Clara. Just focus on your job and leave the lawyering to the professionals." His words stung, but instead of discouraging her, they fueled her determination. If anything, she wanted to prove him wrong. One day, while volunteering at a community center, Clara met a retired attorney named Mr. Peterson. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and a kind smile, known in Maplewood for taking on pro bono cases long after his retirement. Intrigued by stories of Clara's work, he struck up a conversation with her. "I hear you've been helping folks around here," he said, raising an eyebrow. Clara nodded nervously, unsure of what to expect. To her relief, Mr. Peterson didn't criticize her. Instead, he offered guidance. Over coffee, he explained the importance of understanding courtroom etiquette, the value of concise arguments, and how to build a strong case using evidence. He also encouraged her to consider pursuing formal education. "If you're serious about this, Clara, you need to go deeper. Books and online videos can only take you so far." Inspired by his advice, Clara made a bold decision. She enrolled in night classes at a nearby community college, studying pre-law courses while continuing to work full-time. Balancing her job, studies, and volunteer work was exhausting, but Clara thrived on the challenge. Her days became a blur of spreadsheets at the grocery store, late-night cramming sessions, and weekends spent assisting those in need. Though sleep-deprived and often overwhelmed, she found joy in the process. Every new concept she learned felt like unlocking a door to a world she had once thought inaccessible, and every person she helped reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. Her dedication did not go unnoticed. One evening, as she sat in class listening to a lecture on contract law, her professor called her name unexpectedly. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his tone warm but curious. NBHE continued. "Ms. Bennett," her professor said, his tone warm but curious. "You seem unusually passionate about this subject. Most students take these classes as a stepping stone, but you act like you're fighting for your life." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Clara. She felt her cheeks flush, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, she considered brushing off the comment with a simple, "I just like learning," but something stopped her. Maybe it was the sincerity in the professor's voice, or the weight of everything she had been through. Whatever it was, Clara decided to be honest. "I guess I am fighting for my life," she replied softly, meeting his gaze. "A few years ago, I was taken advantage of because I didn't know the law. I felt powerless, and no one seemed to care. That's why I'm here, to make sure I never feel that way again. And maybe along the way I can help others who've been in the same position." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in quiet understanding. The professor smiled, slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he said after a pause, "if that's your goal, then let me tell you something. You're already halfway there. Passion is what drives good lawyers. Knowledge will come with time, but having a reason to fight, that's rare." His words stayed with Clara long after the class ended. They reminded her of why she had started this journey and gave her the courage to keep going, even when things got tough. As the months passed, Clara threw herself into her studies with renewed energy. She spent countless nights hunched over textbooks, scribbling notes until her hand cramped. During breaks at work, she quizzed herself on legal terms using flashcards she kept in her bag. On weekends, she attended free workshops hosted by local attorneys, soaking up every bit of advice they offered. Slowly but surely, the complex language of the law began to feel less foreign. What once seemed like an impenetrable wall of jargon started to reveal patterns and logic. Clara realized that the law wasn't just about rules, it was about fairness, justice, and giving people a voice. Her growing expertise didn't go unnoticed in Maplewood. More and more people came to her for help, trusting her to guide them through disputes, contracts, or minor legal issues. One day, a young single mother named Lisa approached her, visibly distressed. Her landlord had evicted her without proper notice, leaving her and her 2 children scrambling to find shelter. Clara listened patiently, asking questions to understand the situation fully. After reviewing the lease agreement and researching tenant rights, she discovered that the eviction violated several state laws. With Clara's guidance, Lisa filed a complaint with the housing authority and eventually won the right to return to her apartment, with compensation for the wrongful eviction. Stories like Lisa's became common. Each success strengthened Clara's reputation as someone who could be counted on, no matter how small or hopeless a case seemed. People admired not only her knowledge but also her kindness and patience. Unlike some lawyers who charged exorbitant fees and spoke in ways that left clients confused, Clara explained things clearly and treated everyone with respect. She charged little to nothing for her services, knowing firsthand how hard it was to afford legal help. Word of her work spread beyond Maplewood, reaching neighboring towns. Strangers drove miles just to seek her advice, and Clara welcomed them all with open arms. Despite her achievements, Clara faced challenges that tested her resolve. Balancing work, studies, and volunteer cases often left her exhausted. There were nights when she collapsed into bed too tired to eat, her mind still racing with thoughts of pending deadlines and unanswered questions. Financial strain added another layer of difficulty. Paying for tuition and books stretched her budget thin, forcing her to cut back on essentials. Friends invited her to dinners or outings, but Clara declined, unable to justify spending money on luxuries when every penny counted toward her dream. Loneliness crept in occasionally, especially during holidays when everyone else seemed to have plans while she stayed home to study. Yet, despite these hardships, Clara refused to give up. Every obstacle only made her stronger and more determined. One evening, as she sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen grading papers from her night class, Clara received an unexpected phone call. It was Mr. Peterson, the retired attorney who had first encouraged her to pursue formal education. His voice sounded urgent. "Clara, I need your help," he said without preamble. A close friend of his, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, was being sued by a large corporation over a property dispute. The stakes were high and Mrs. Harper couldn't afford a lawyer. Knowing Clara's reputation, Mr. Peterson thought she might be willing to step in, even though this case was far more complicated than anything she had handled before. Clara hesitated. Taking on such a high-profile case felt daunting, especially since she was still technically a student. But deep down, she knew this was an opportunity to test herself, to see if she truly had what it took to stand up against powerful opponents. After a brief pause, she agreed. "I'll do my best," she told Mr. Peterson firmly. Over the next few weeks, Clara poured every ounce of her energy into preparing for the case. She researched tirelessly, analyzed precedents, and drafted arguments late into the night. When doubts crept in, she reminded herself of all the people counting on her, not just Mrs. Harper, but everyone who believed in her ability to make a difference. The day of the hearing arrived, and Clara found herself standing nervously outside the courthouse. This time, however, she wasn't the plaintiff fumbling through papers. She was the advocate, ready to present her case. As she stepped inside, she noticed familiar faces in the crowd, friends, neighbors, and even former clients who had come to support her. Their presence gave her strength. For the first time, Clara walked into a courtroom not as someone seeking justice for herself, but as someone determined to deliver it to others. Little did she know this case would mark a turning point, not just in her career, but in the way people viewed her role in the community. The courtroom was packed that morning, buzzing with anticipation. Clara stood at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding as she adjusted the stack of papers in front of her. This wasn't just another case. It felt like a test of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Across the room, the opposing lawyers sat confidently, their expensive suits and polished demeanor making them look untouchable. They represented a large corporation accused of illegally claiming ownership of Mrs. Harper's property, a piece of land she had inherited from her late husband. For Clara, this fight was personal. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that even someone without wealth or connections could stand up against injustice. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Clara took a deep breath. She reminded herself of all the hours she had spent preparing for this moment. Every late night, every skipped meal, every sacrifice had led her here. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, smoothing her simple blouse before addressing the court. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but as she laid out her argument, clarity replaced nerves. She spoke plainly, avoiding unnecessary jargon so that everyone in the room, especially Mrs. Harper, could understand. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is about fairness. My client has lived on this land for decades, caring for it and respecting its history. The corporation claims ownership based on outdated records, but we have evidence showing those records are inaccurate. Clara presented her case methodically, pointing to documents, photographs, and witness statements that supported Mrs. Harper's claim. She highlighted discrepancies in the corporation's arguments, exposing flaws in their reasoning. The opposing lawyers tried to interrupt, raising objections and attempting to undermine her points. But Clara remained calm. She countered each challenge with precision, drawing on the knowledge she had painstakingly acquired over years of study. By the time she finished speaking, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. People exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly, while others whispered quietly among themselves. Even the judge seemed impressed, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was considering her arguments carefully. When the ruling was announced days later, it came as a shock, not only to Clara, but to the entire town. The judge sided with Mrs. Harper, declaring that the corporation's claim was invalid. Cheers erupted in the courtroom as Mrs. Harper hugged Clara tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Outside, reporters waited eagerly, eager to capture the story of the underdog who had taken on a corporate giant, and won. For Clara, the victory was bittersweet. While she was thrilled to have helped Mrs. Harper, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were still countless others like her who needed someone to fight for them. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. Local newspapers published articles about Clara, praising her determination and skill. A radio station invited her to share her story on air, and soon calls flooded in from people seeking her help. Some were facing eviction, others dealing with unfair contracts or predatory lenders. Clara agreed to assist as many as she could, though the growing demand stretched her already limited resources thin. Despite the challenges, she refused to turn anyone away. Each new case fueled her passion, reminding her of why she had started this journey in the first place. During this whirlwind of activity, Clara received another life-changing invitation. One of her professors from the community college reached out, suggesting she apply for a scholarship to attend law school full-time. "You've proven yourself more than capable," he wrote in an email. "This could be your chance to take things to the next level." At first, Clara hesitated. Law school was expensive and she wasn't sure she could afford it, even with financial aid. But something inside her urged her to try. If she wanted to make a real difference, she needed proper credentials, the kind that would open doors and give her the authority to enact change. Filling out the application felt surreal. As she listed her achievements and wrote essays explaining her motivations, Clara reflected on how far she had come. From the woman mocked in court to the advocate celebrated in headlines, her transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. Still, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Law school was notoriously demanding, requiring long hours and intense focus. Yet, the thought of giving up never crossed her mind. With grit and determination, she submitted her application. And, weeks later, she received the news. She had been accepted, along with a partial scholarship. Law school proved to be as challenging as Clara had anticipated. Classes were rigorous, assignments relentless, and competition fierce. Many of her classmates came from privileged backgrounds, having attended prestigious universities and interned at top firms. They spoke confidently about their futures, discussing clerkships and high-paying jobs in big cities. Clara, on the other hand, kept her goals grounded. She wasn't there to climb corporate ladders or chase fame. She was there to learn how to serve her community better. Her humility and dedication earned her respect among peers and professors alike. One professor in particular took notice of Clara's potential. Dr. Elena Martinez, a renowned expert in civil rights law, became a mentor to her. During office hours, they discussed landmark cases, debated legal theories, and explored ways to address systemic inequalities. "You have a gift, Clara," Dr. Martinez told her one afternoon. "Not everyone walks into this field with such a clear sense of purpose. Don't lose sight of it." Those words stayed with Clara, guiding her through moments of doubt and exhaustion. By her final year of law school, Clara had gained invaluable experience. She interned at a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping low-income families navigate legal challenges. She also participated in moot court competitions, honing her skills in public speaking and argumentation. Each success added to her confidence, reinforcing her belief that she was meant to be here. But perhaps the most significant milestone came when she passed the bar exam on her third attempt. Tears streamed down her face as she held the results in trembling hands, realizing that she was now officially a lawyer, a title she had once thought impossible to earn. Returning to Maplewood as a licensed attorney, Clara opened a small office above a bakery downtown. She called it Harper and Bennett Legal Services, naming it after Mrs. Harper to honor the case that had changed everything. Her rates were modest, and she often worked pro bono for clients who couldn't afford representation. Word spread quickly, and before long her office became a beacon of hope for those in need. People trusted her not because of fancy degrees or flashy advertisements, but because they knew she understood their struggles. She had walked in their shoes, fought their battles, and emerged victorious, not for glory, but for justice. Yet, even as Clara settled into her role as a practicing lawyer, she couldn't ignore the whispers of something greater calling to her. One evening, as she closed her office and stepped onto the quiet street, she noticed a flyer pinned to the community bulletin board. It advertised an upcoming vacancy for a judge position in the same courthouse where she had once been ridiculed. For a moment, Clara froze, staring at the paper as if it held a secret message meant only for her. Could she really do it? Could she step into a role that once seemed unimaginable? The idea terrified her, but it also excited her. If there was one thing Clara had learned throughout her journey, it was that fear should never stop you from reaching for what matters most. Clara stood in front of her mirror that night, staring at her reflection as if trying to find the answer written on her face. The flyer she had seen earlier sat crumpled but still visible on her kitchen counter. Applying for the judge position felt like stepping into uncharted territory, a leap so bold it scared her. She knew what people would say. They'd call her foolish, remind her she didn't have the connections or experience needed for such a role. But deep down, Clara couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward the idea. If she became a judge, she could do more than just help individuals one case at a time. She could shape how justice was served in her community. That thought alone kept her awake until dawn. The application process was daunting. It required essays, letters of recommendation, and interviews with panels of seasoned professionals who would scrutinize every aspect of her qualifications. Clara spent weeks preparing, drafting, and redrafting her responses, practicing answers to potential questions and gathering support from mentors like Dr. Martinez and Mr. Peterson. When she finally submitted her application, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the hardest part was over, but dread because now she had to wait, unsure if her efforts would amount to anything. Weeks passed before Clara received the news. She had been shortlisted for an interview. Her heart raced as she read the email confirming the date and time. This was it, the moment when she would stand face to face with the people who held the power to decide her future. On the day of the interview, Clara dressed carefully, choosing a professional yet understated outfit. As she walked into the conference room where the panel waited, she felt the weight of their eyes on her. These were men and women who had spent decades in the legal system, their resumes filled with accomplishments far beyond hers. Yet Clara reminded herself why she was here, not to impress them, but to show them what she could bring to the bench. The questions came fast and sharp. "Why do you think you're qualified for this role?" one panelist asked, his tone skeptical. Another chimed in. "Judges need years of courtroom experience. How can you justify your lack of it?" Clara listened intently, letting each question sink in before responding. She spoke honestly about her journey, emphasizing not just her legal knowledge but also her understanding of the struggles ordinary people faced within the system. "I'm not here because I come from privilege or connections," she said firmly. "I'm here because I've lived through injustice. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to feel powerless, and I believe that makes me uniquely suited to ensure fairness for everyone who steps into my courtroom." Her sincerity caught them off guard. Some panelists leaned forward, intrigued by her perspective. Others remained cautious, probing further, with tougher questions. One woman in particular seemed determined to challenge Clara's resolve. What happens when emotions cloud your judgment? Can you remain impartial even when someone reminds you of yourself? Clara took a deep breath. She understood the concern. It was a valid one. Being impartial doesn't mean being cold, she replied. It means listening to both sides without bias and making decisions based on facts and law. My experiences don't make me less fair. They make me more aware of the importance of justice. By the end of the interview, Clara felt drained but proud. She had given everything she had, holding nothing back. Whether or not she got the position, she knew she had done her best. Days turned into weeks as she waited for the results, returning to her work at Harper & Bennett Legal Services while trying to keep her mind off the outcome. Clients noticed her preoccupation but said nothing, sensing that something big was happening in her life. When the letter arrived, Clara hesitated to open it. She sat at her desk, tracing the envelope with trembling fingers. Finally, she tore it open and began reading. Halfway through the first paragraph, her hands flew to her mouth. She had been selected as the new judge. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality sank in. All those late nights studying, all the doubts and sacrifices, it had led her here. Clara called Mrs. Harper first, unable to contain her excitement. "You did it!" Mrs. Harper exclaimed, her voice breaking with joy. "This is exactly where you belong." On her first day as a judge, Clara woke up earlier than usual, her nerves tingling with anticipation. She chose her robe carefully, smoothing out any wrinkles before heading to the courthouse. The same building that once witnessed her humiliation now greeted her with respect. As she walked down the familiar hallway, she noticed the subtle changes. People, nodding politely, some even offering congratulations. Entering the courtroom, she took her seat at the bench, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. For a moment, she closed her eyes, steadying herself. Then, with a calm voice, she called the session to order. The cases that day varied widely, from minor traffic violations to disputes over property boundaries. Clara listened attentively to each argument, asking clarifying questions and ensuring both parties had equal opportunity to present their side. Her approach was methodical, yet compassionate, earning nods of approval from lawyers and spectators alike. By lunchtime, word had spread among the courthouse staff. Judge Bennett was different. She wasn't afraid to dig deeper, to ask the tough questions others might overlook. And most importantly, she treated everyone, regardless of background, with dignity and respect. One case stood out in particular. A young man named Daniel stood accused of vandalizing a local business. His public defender argued that he had acted out of desperation after losing his job and struggling to provide for his family. The prosecution pushed for maximum penalties, citing the damage caused. Clara listened carefully to both sides, asking Daniel directly about his circumstances. When he admitted his guilt but explained the pressures he faced, Clara paused. She knew the law allowed for leniency in certain situations. After deliberating, she sentenced him to community service instead of jail time, urging him to use the experience as an opportunity to rebuild his life. As Daniel left the courtroom, his head bowed but hopeful, Clara felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice wasn't always about punishment. It was about finding solutions that helped people move forward. Over time, Clara's reputation grew. Lawyers began referring to her courtroom as the fair bench, knowing they could expect transparency and consistency in her rulings. Citizens trusted her to hear their cases without prejudice, spreading stories of her wisdom and fairness throughout Maplewood. Even those who had doubted her initially found themselves admiring her dedication. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the courthouse, a familiar figure approached her. It was Mr. Grayson, the contractor who had once scammed her. He looked older, his confidence replaced by nervousness. "Judge Bennett," he stammered, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. About everything." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apologies are important," she said simply, "but actions matter more. Let's hope you've learned from your mistakes." As months turned into years, Clara continued to serve her community with unwavering commitment. She introduced programs aimed at educating residents about their legal rights, partnering with schools and community centers to reach as many people as possible. Young, aspiring lawyers often visited her chambers seeking advice inspired by her story. To each of them, she offered the same piece of wisdom. Never let fear stop you from pursuing what's right. Life will test you, but it's your response that defines you. Clara never forgot her roots or the struggles that brought her here. What started as a personal quest for justice had evolved into a legacy of empowerment, one that reminded everyone in Maplewood that even the simplest acts of courage could lead to extraordinary outcomes. Years passed, and Clara's presence in the courthouse became a symbol of hope for the people of Maplewood. Her courtroom was different from others. It wasn't just a place where laws were enforced. It was a space where fairness and compassion intertwined. People began to see her not as someone who handed down judgments, but as someone who listened, understood, and cared. Whether it was a landlord-tenant dispute, a custody battle, or a minor criminal offense, Clara approached each case with the same level of seriousness. She made sure everyone left her courtroom feeling heard, even if they didn't always get the outcome they wanted. Her influence extended beyond the walls of the courthouse. Clara started hosting free legal workshops in community centers, libraries, and schools. These sessions weren't just about teaching people their rights. They were about empowering them to stand up for themselves. She used simple language, real-life examples, and interactive discussions to break down complex legal concepts. Parents brought their children hoping they'd learn valuable lessons early on. Teenagers attended out of curiosity, only to leave inspired by her stories of perseverance. Even some local business owners joined in, eager to understand how to operate ethically and avoid conflicts. Through these workshops, Clara planted seeds of change, nurturing a generation that valued justice and equality. One summer evening, after a particularly long day at the courthouse, Clara received an unexpected visitor. It was Lisa, the single mother whose eviction case had been one of Clara's first victories years ago. Now Lisa stood before her with a bright smile, holding the hand of her youngest child. "I came to thank you again," Lisa said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You gave us our home back then, but more than that, you gave me hope. I wouldn't be where I am today without you." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. Seeing Lisa thriving, working a steady job, raising confident kids, was proof that her efforts mattered. It reminded her why she had fought so hard to get here. As time went on, Clara's work caught the attention of larger organizations. A national nonprofit dedicated to legal reform invited her to speak at a conference in the city. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, and addressing hundreds of lawyers and activists seemed intimidating. But something about the invitation resonated with her. If she could share her story, if she could inspire others to believe in the power of fairness and determination, then maybe her journey could have an even greater impact. So she accepted. The conference hall buzzed with energy when Clara took the stage. Spotlights illuminated her as she stepped up to the podium, clutching her notes tightly. For a moment, she scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of faces watching her expectantly. Then she began to speak. She told them about the day she sat in court, mocked and defeated, feeling powerless against a system she didn't understand. She recounted the sleepless nights spent studying, the sacrifices she made, and the moments of doubt that almost broke her. And she shared the triumphs, the cases won, the lives changed, the dream realized. By the end of her speech, the room erupted into applause. Many attendees approached her afterward, thanking her for her honesty and courage. Some even asked how they could replicate her model of grassroots advocacy in their own communities. Back in Maplewood, Clara continued to push for reforms within the legal system. She advocated for policies that prioritized accessibility, ensuring that no one was denied justice because of financial barriers. She worked with local officials to create a fund for low-income residents seeking legal representation, drawing inspiration from the struggles she herself had faced. Her tireless efforts earned her recognition far beyond her small town. Newspapers published profiles on her, calling her a champion of the underdog. Television shows invited her for interviews, eager to hear her perspective on making the law more inclusive. Yet, despite the growing fame, Clara remained grounded. To her, success wasn't measured by accolades, but by the difference she made in people's lives. One crisp autumn morning, Clara decided to visit the garden behind her apartment, a quiet corner she had nurtured over the years. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the ground. She knelt beside a patch of marigolds, gently pulling out weeds. As she worked, memories flooded her mind. The days she spent doubting herself, the nights she cried over books she couldn't comprehend, the victories that brought tears of joy. She thought about how far she had come, from being an ordinary woman dismissed by society to becoming a judge respected by all. The journey hadn't been easy, but every step had been worth it. Later that day, a young girl knocked on Clara's door. She introduced herself as Mia, a high school student working on a project about inspiring women in their community. "Can I ask you some questions?" Mia asked shyly, clutching a notebook. Clara smiled warmly and invited her inside. Over tea, Mia peppered her with queries. "What advice would you give to someone who feels like giving up? How did you stay motivated? Do you ever feel scared?" Clara answered each question thoughtfully, sharing pieces of wisdom she had gathered along the way. Before leaving, Mia hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I want to be like you when I grow up." That night, as Clara sat by her window watching the stars twinkle in the sky, she reflected on her life. She realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by her journey. From Mrs. Harper to Lisa, from Daniel to Mia, her actions had created ripples that reached farther than she could have imagined. And though there were still challenges ahead, she knew she had built something lasting, a legacy of fairness, resilience, and hope. Clara closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the night wrap around her. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, echoing through the sleepy town. Life in Maplewood carried on as usual, but things were different now. People believed in justice, not because it was promised, but because they had seen it in action. They believed in second chances, in standing up for what was right, and in the idea that anyone, no matter how ordinary, could achieve extraordinary things. And at the heart of it all was Clara Bennett, a simple woman who had once been mocked in court, but had risen to become its most trusted guardian.